My talk is sort of informally called the Composer's Workshop, or the Parts of Rhetoric. And I'm not a scholar or a rhetorician of any kind. So this is using the parts of rhetoric that are laid out in Cicero as a way of understanding how a couple of these votive antiphons from the Peterhouse part books operate rhetorically and musically. It's perhaps valuable at the outset to say that our take on this is that these are, like any kind of rhetorical deliverance, meant as a highly persuasive form of address. And this counters a view which used to be common. I don't think really people think this anymore, but people have said, as I just read quoted in someone's dissertation, the large antiphon was a supremely impersonal musical speech, as spacious and remote as the lofty vaulted chapels that gave it birth. Or, medieval composers had no direct interests in their texts. The correlation of tone and word remained haphazard. Almost any music could be composed to almost any words. Now, like any statement, sort of blanket statement, there are specific instances, I think, in where that may be true. As we've done a lot of Ockeghem, it's not clear to us that the direct correspondence between the text of the Mass and the melodies which Ockeghem has written to set it to correspond in any way, clear way that we can understand. But I think with the votive antiphon, this is really not the case at all. And because it's a personal kind of address rather than a hieratic utterance, the way the Mass is meant to, the words need to be said ritually, but they don't need to be delivered persuasively. But this is not the case with a votive antiphon. The point of a votive antiphon is to persuade somebody, generally Mary, to intercede on our behalf so that we can proceed directly to heaven as soon as possible, and with luck skip all the intervening pains of purgatory. The votive antiphons were sung at the end, generally, of the evening devotion. So after Compline, they're often the last item tagged on to evensong. And we can imagine, as I said last night, that the shades of night are falling and we're gathered in a beautiful chapel where the light is getting dim, and the singers sing on their own behalf a plea for intercession. And one thing we might talk about later this afternoon is who else might have heard this and what the intended audience is. But clearly it's sung on our behalf, as the text today makes really clear, the Aston that we'll look at. So there are five parts of rhetoric according to this scheme. The inventio, or the invention of your material. The disposition, how you arrange it, how you lay out your arguments in the course of your speech. And elocutio, that's your eloquence, your decoration, the way you dress up what you say so that, on a cynical view, it appears to be much more important than it actually is, just read for the content. That's cynical. It's making your speech more beautiful and enticing in a way which honors the recipient as well as the material you are delivering. There's then memoria. This is very important in medieval preparation for anything, is to memorize your material. We don't generally memorize our material, and I don't think votive antiphons were ever sung from memory. So the analog might be perhaps rehearsal, so that we prepare our presentation of the arguments so that our delivery is as persuasive as possible. And what we actually do in rehearsal is something we might talk about a little bit later in the talk. We'll come back to it. What we're dealing with is really concrete and practical matters as musicians. Is this third in tune? What's the size of a semitone? Are we matching the vowels? What quality of consonant do we want to use for any particular word, and so forth? That's what we actually do in rehearsal. And there's usually a lot of dirty jokes in our rehearsals, but that's just us. I don't think that's necessarily, well, it might be common to all musical ensembles. Finally, there's the pronunciatio, the delivery. That's actually getting out and doing it. And there are ways in which you deliver your material which will make it more or less persuasive. So first, we start from the inventio, and we're going to first look at this short antiphon of Robert Hunt's Ave Maria Mater Dei. The text is in your program somewhere towards the end of the translation section. I know the thing is an absolute book this time, but there's a bunch of translations, and at the last page of translations has this piece on it. So it starts out, this is a text, a variant of a text from 15th century books of hours. There's one other setting of this text that survives by William Cornish, which is in the Eton Choir book, which copied circa 1500. Makes an interesting comparison. We start out always by addressing the person that we wish to persuade. In this case, it's the Mother of God. And we start out with a salutation. We say, Ave Maria. And the contras start. Easy. Outlining the mode as well, telling us where we're going to end, or one of the possible places we might end is. That, of course, will be answered by other voices. Now, having hailed her, we engage her attention with a series of laudatory epithets. In every case in this piece, again, it's the contras who say it. They say, Mother of God, Mater Dei. Mater Dei. They say, Regina Caeli, Queen of Heaven. Regina Caeli. We're getting more and more florid and complicated as we go. They say, Domina Mundi, Lady of the World. And we're in a different tonal area as well. And now our favorite, the Pamela Dellal favorite epithet for Mary, Empress of Hell. It's a complicated idea, so it takes a lot of musical material to express it. They go on, and now we have her attention. But of course, those are just the leading points of music. They are answered in every case. We're going to come back to that. But now that we've got her attention, the next thing that will follow will be a prayer. We address her and we say, have mercy on us. And at this point, new singers enter. And they will be answered. And we go on to say, have mercy on us, and it's quite extended. But do not let us fall into mortal sin, but let us implement your most holy will. And the but is very interesting. Again, the basses lead it here. And then we're going to find out what her Santissimam Voluntatem goes on. It's a while. Oh, so those are the arguments. That's pretty much it. Once we say, let us do that, Amen. And the Amen is extended. It's a decoration at the end. It's the peroration. It's sending us off in a rapture of melisma. So we're on to the disposition. We've got the arguments, and these votive antiphons musically are structured exactly on the basis of the grammar and the syntax of the texts. I've just heard Nick say the same thing last night, so I'm confident to say that that, I think, is the rule. I'm not sure that there are any exceptions to that rule. There is no previous structuring material in this piece. There's no canus firmus or anything. And if there were any way, we would still follow the argument of the text to create the musical structure of the piece, or composer would. Okay, so here are now our arguments elaborated or disposed. So Ave Maria started by the contras and answered by the trebles. Ave Maria Mater Dei. And they are answering each other in an imitation. It's very easy to hear. It's more or less the same material. They make, once, at least for the head of the motive, so for the beginning, the words, the part you need to understand. This is really important because it becomes a polemical point of issue between Protestants and Catholics, or between Protestant and Catholic forms of viewpoints, as to whether you can understand the words in all this massive polyphony and melisma. And in fact, I would say that in general, if we are doing our job correctly, and if the composer's done generally his job correctly, then you should be able to understand every word. Certainly, we can understand every word. And if you're listening carefully, I think you ought to be able as well. And it has to do with the way they are set. There's a lot of information verbally up front before we get to a melisma, so we get information and decoration. You don't have to choose between meaning and beauty. There are, however, 5 parts in this piece. We've just heard 2, and the means have something to add to this, something that's not exactly imitative, but decorates it. And maybe I'll take this opportunity to introduce everybody here and tell you what they're doing. The top part of the Tudor 5-part ensemble was trebles. This is a peculiarly English specialty, these high voices, which on the continent did not so much exist until the 17th century. England made a special point of training these boys. It begins in the latter part of the 15th century, and it continues up to Reformation, and then it's interrupted, and it's never really resumed for years after that. Eventually, the continent picks it up in the 17th century. So these are our treble specialists. They would have been boys. We're fortunate to have women, and they are Teresa Wakim and Shari Wilson and Margot Rood. And every time I do this, I have a nightmare, because once in a concert long ago in Stamford, I had to introduce everybody on stage, people I worked with all the time and knew very well, and I got to one soprano, and I looked at her, and I could not remember her name. And it was a much larger audience of people that were not already friendly. Now, the second part from the top, they're called the medius, or means, and it's not entirely sure why that name, but they seem to be sort of the average voice of a boy. If the boy was not inclined to a particularly high voice, or perhaps it's a slightly older boy, as voices do change with age, and these are the means or the medius. On the continent, the equivalent range was generally sung by a falsettist, an adult male singing in a falsetto voice, and we have one of those, Martin Neer, and we're also fortunate to have women on this part, and they are Jennifer Ashe and Pamela Dellal. The third part down is called the contratenor, and it's not a countertenor in the 20th century sense, which is to say someone like Martin, a man singing falsetto. That's what we think of. That's Alfred Deller's appropriation of a historical term to describe what he wanted to do for which in the middle of the 20th century there was not a real explanation for many people in his audience who found him rather odd rather than a beautiful musician and singer. The classic case is when he sings a Purcell song and he sings, "'Tis nature's voice," and someone at the back says, "Bloody well isn't." Countertenor gave him a respectable historical pedigree, but it's not actually his. The contratenor is a part written against the tenor and in roughly the same range, perhaps slightly higher. So it's a highish tenor by this point, and it is sung here by Owen McIntosh and Jason McStoots. Now, we'll show you that tenors and contratenors can be interchangeable because Mark and Jason are going to exchange in the course of this morning. Finally, we have the most important part. The tenors, they are the ones who, if there were a pre-existing cantus firmus melody, they would sing it. And it's their sort of ordinary tenor, a sort of average man's voice, which is not to say that it's not as hard as doing any of these other things. It just happens to be the voice that nature gave you. And they are Mark Sprinkle and Michael Barrett. And at the bottom of the texture, we often have three people, but Paul is off singing at Emmanuel this morning and will be here for the concert this afternoon. The basses, they are the foundation of everything, but not in the way that it becomes later, where we're talking about harmonic music. In this music, all the parts are equally persuasive and equally contrapuntal, and they do not always sing the fundamental of the harmony. And there's some very strikingly beautiful instances of that at cadences in some of the music that we did last night. They are David McFerrin and Stephen Hrycelak. All right, now you know who they all are. We'll proceed with our subjects here. So we've hailed her, Ave Maria, Mater Dei, and now we go on to praise her a little farther, and she is the Queen of Heaven. Oh, we skipped one. Right. Oh, I wanted to show you that the Ave Maria was decorated by the means. So here's the beginning again. So again, it's basically an imitative structure here between these two parts to which the means contribute to decoration. And sometimes they're using the same material, and sometimes they're using a sort of rhythmically adjusted version of it, or a rhythmic theme that's not exactly the same notes. We have available a great range of compositional strategies for imitation. It's much more flexible in this late medieval music than it is in England than it already is on the continent by this time, where it's more the standard Renaissance polyphony model, where every voice sings exactly the same thing and they come in order, and then we have a second point of imitation. This is much more supple and complicated, but nevertheless very carefully organized. Regina Caeli, here's a very exact imitation between the three parts and also at a regular time interval.
With the head motive only or with all the...
Let's just do the head motive, of the Regina Caeli. Is that right? Or yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
So the means have a slightly different version, but it's recognizably imitative, and it happens exactly at predictable intervals. Now, a predictable interval is a time interval is a way of getting our brains into the cart so that we're following. And we'll see this in Aston very clearly later, I think. Now, Domina Mundi, here the imitation is perhaps even closer, but the time interval is quite irregular. And once you keep going to the end of mundi, or at least to sopranos, we'll go to the downbeat. We'll just finish up the downbeat of 14, and you guys don't come in.
Don't come in.
It would have been a cadence, but the sopranos decided they're going to stop for a moment, and what they will go on with is something decorative. So that kind of cadence where two parts are going to land together also has different forms of how conclusive it is. One of the ways of making it less conclusive is for one of the parts, often, well, it could be either part, to hesitate before resolving, and then pause for a moment. And then imperatrix goes from there. And again, this is almost regular and fairly exact. And this takes us to the cadence before miserere.
Imperatrix in
The sopranos take you by surprise because imperatrix in fair, one more beat, imperatrix. It's a little bit, it should, if we're listening carefully, set us off a little bit. And in fact, what happens right after it is an addition of a beat somewhere in the metrical scheme. We're generally looking at music, the originals have no bar lines whatsoever, but this is organized basically in duple, so you can count it in 2 or in 4, and suddenly there's a unit of 3 in order to get to a cadence here. English composers, I think, are more given to doing this at this period than their continental counterparts. Again, English composers are more subtle, or free, or varied, or complicated, or medieval. All right, can we just hear that whole opening up to that point? It's a real cadence. They're done, but we're not done. Miserere will come in now. And here, when we've got 5 parts at your disposal, there's a very high value placed on variety. And this is praised by writers such as Tinctorius. He's a theoretician from the 15th century. Variety is really the soul of musical composition and of rhetorical delivery, because if you say the same thing over and over and over again in the same way, your audience will stop listening. So simply a change of texture is a way of refreshing your ears. So having gotten the high trio will now change to the low voices. And they will sing miserere, but miserere is something that we all say, miserere nostri. It's almost, perhaps almost, maybe always set for everybody.
Miserere
This is also going to demonstrate why conductors are not needed. It's an important point which should be underlined. Directors don't do what most people think they do. Maybe we'll get to that later too. Now, we're going to resume and say, not just on our behalf, we've underlined that by a cadence. Have mercy on us. Oh yes, and also all the rest of Christian people. And do not permit us to fall into mortal sin. But, so this is the first section. And here we'll hear some really strong dissonances on mortaliter, mortally, and peccare, to sin. These are words which offer an opportunity to be underlined by a sort of illustration of pain, which is a dissonance, two notes that do not, cannot remain sustained, but must resolve into something that gives you rest. Could we do that? Something new? Going to dissolve because the bass, that's dissolving, but underneath the basses are going to say sed tuam. And here everybody says exactly the same thing, and it's absolutely regular, but we do have a little bit of a dispute about whether we're going to sing a B natural or B flat, and this lends a kind of urgency. So two forms of the same note. You'll hear this pretty clearly. So just the head motives of sed tuam.
Sed tuam sanctissima. Sed tuam sanctissima. Sed tuam sanctissima. Sed tuam sanctissima.
And one more.
Sed tuam sanctissima.
It's great that we have 5 voices, and but if we really want extra emphasis, we can have more than 5 entrances, and the basses get the last word. And that launches, and that sentence is not done, though. Sed tuam sanctissimam voluntatem, your holy will, ad implere, to implement or put into effect. And that will set us off until the Amen. Now, let's hear this decorated because it's much more interesting. But that's the bones of the entry, but everything that comes after that is invented more or less freely, either by Robert Hunt or Nick Sandon. And we'll go to the cadence before the Amen.
Sed tuam sanctissima.
Beautiful. But what's the note we started on? Could you sing your first Regina, the Mater Ave Maria right at the beginning? not where we just stopped. So we know we're not done. We're in this beautiful world of implementing her holy will, and we end up in a beautiful C cadence with a Mi major third, but we're not done. It's going to be an Amen, which will explore many different regions of harmony and bring us back to a penitential sort of ending, or possibly supplicatory anyway. Modal music is a little different from tonal music. So I'm thinking, if tonal music, you think our Baroque, if Vivaldi and Beethoven are the real standard bearers of drive by 5/1, 5/1, 5/1, 5/1, 1, 1, 1. This is Beethoven. It's really, really important. Say 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. I mean 1. We're done. 5/1 at the end. So, but tonal and modal music does not work this way at all. It's much more meandery because it's not driven in this same harmonic way, and it's more exploring different possibilities of harmony. So it's a little bit more like being out walking in the woods and seeing all this different scenery. You know, you're not driving down a highway. Or Beethoven, I suppose it wasn't a highway, but a fast road. It's not fast either, but you know where you're going. In this stuff, you don't actually see the end of the journey until you get there. Okay, we're going to almost sing it all the way through for you. What's the function of that amen then? It's not, is it purely musical? Supremely impersonal musical speech? It's spacious and remote, exactly? It's not really. I think that part of it is that we are ornamenting our address and making it beautiful. We are honoring the divine recipient of our supplication, and we are, I think, at least individually, celebrating beauty in the world, which in a religious viewpoint is given by God. God created the potential of all of this. So it's actually doing God honor to explore this beautiful potential we have to sing. And singers, I can say as an instrumentalist, singers have this better than anybody down because they have voices, they have words, and they're just in their bodies, which instrumentalists, we all aspire to this, but it's a fiction, we know that. At least people who work with singers know that. Elocutio is next, the elaboration or decoration. So this, I might say, these are all these counter melodies. So this sort of stripped down to bare bones analysis gives a very poor idea of the full experience of the piece, where every argument is being decorated or counter-argued simultaneously. And you've got to really keep your wits about you because there may be 5 people speaking simultaneously. And it's good to be able to understand all of them. And in fact, from our standpoint, I am listening to you propose a melodic or contrapuntal argument and responding to it at the same time, perhaps changing, putting a slightly different emphasis, or in fact even contradicting it, but in a way that harmonically fits. It's very complicated. Memoria is the next step. Well, we've done that prior to this, preferably, which is said that we've done our rehearsal at home. And it's not really complicated what we rehearse. We really do rehearse, are we all singing ah, or how tall is that vowel? Or even more crude, is the word demizit or demizit? We've selected what kind of Latin we're going to sing. We're going to sing a very highly flavored 16th century sort of English Latin. Very conveniently for us, it's almost as if an American just read the text without any knowledge of how to pronounce Latin. And that is more or less how people operated in the past. Latin was not a foreign language to people who were trained. it's a sort of second language and it's just as good as your own, and why would you say something like someone would say in Rome? For one thing, I've never been to Rome, and for another thing, in Canterbury, we say demisit, because that's what it says on the page. It's very useful for Americans, because it's quite like American Latin. Now, finally, our performance. This is another thing we rehearse. How fast are we going to go? Do we have to do everything through all the way at the same speed? No, we do not. This is often thought of as this sort of variety and Baroque sort of delivery as being a development of later. But in fact, it's a rhetorical idea from long before, and we know that it was applied already in the 16th century, if not before. Here's Nicola Vincentino. This is 1555. Sometimes a composition is performed according to a certain method that cannot be written down, such as uttering softly and loudly, or fast and slow, or changing the measure, that is, changing the tempo, in keeping with the words, so as to show the effects of the passions and the harmony. This technique of having all the singers at once change the tempo will not seem strange, provided the ensemble agrees on when the tempo is to be changed, thus avoiding errors. The measure should change according to the words, now slower and now faster. Now, this is something that could be imposed quite artificially, and it's a fine line which one can tread over, because in some sense this music proceeds at the speed of your pulse, but we all have different pulses, and our pulses change from moment to moment, even in pre-coffee Europe. And coffee did not arrive until the 17th century with the Turks at the gates of Venice, as far as I understand. So, it's not Venice, Vienna. Nevertheless, one's pulse as we know, one's pulse changes. The experience of the orator can be instructive, says Vincentino, if you observe the technique he follows in his oration, for he speaks now loud and now soft, now slow, now fast, thus greatly moving his listeners. This technique of changing the tempo has a powerful effect on the soul. This is what we're after. It's not effect. It's actually an effect on your soul, not just not a sound effect or a visual effect. If the orator moves listeners with the techniques described above, how much greater and more powerful will be the effect of well-coordinated music recited with the same devices, but now accompanied by harmony. In other words, this extra semantic addition of harmony and melody, which gets into your soul in ways that you cannot describe or even predict necessarily. Other techniques, vocal color, we've talked about the degree to which consonants are pronounced or softened. Do we say pater omnipotentem or pater omnipotentem? And we can you want to exaggerate your delivery in this sort of setting because there's a lot of sound, and also it's got to carry. Tuning, balance. Which section are we drawing your attention to, or who seems to be leading? Which voice in the contrapuntal texture stands out, etc. So, perhaps you will hear some of these in our performances. Now, I am going to conduct, but really the reason is because it's more fun for me to do that. It doesn't have much effect, except that what a director can do, this aspect of keeping people together, that is not at all what a conductor is for. Anyone can do that. And furthermore, any musician can keep a beat together in an ensemble of much larger size than this, including instrumental ensembles, which are quite complicated in terms of logistics, right? The setup is a lot more difficult. orchestras, various orchestras have made a name by saying we're conductorless and how fabulous that is. I mean, various ensembles, and I think, okay, I'm a Baroque violinist. All I did in the early part of my career was play in a group without a conductor. So, the point is, what is there a musical interpretation that is been worked out? And maybe the director in rehearsal facilitates that and guides the selection of choices and sets priorities. But in the actual performance, it may be a sort of energy-focusing thing at best, and it really is fun for the person who did direct. So.